On the 30th of April 1839, Llanidloes became a workers' republic. Yes, it became a workers' republic. Alas, it only lasted for 5 days, but nevertheless, that is what happened. You see, self-employed weavers in the Llanidloes flannel industry were being put out of work by mechanised factories, and at the same time prices were rising. Factory-based work itself was arduous and dangerous, and handloom weavers worked long hours and were often controlled by master weavers. Poverty was rife, unemployment was high, and there were outbreaks of cholera in the 1830s and 1840s. Now, as I previously mentioned, the centre of the woolen trade had been in Shrewsbury, where Llanidloes soft flannel would have been sent for finishing. But by the 19th century, Shrewsbury had lost its monopoly and dominance. At Llanidloes in 1930, there'd been a 5-week strike by woolen workers, which succeeded in winning for them higher wages. However, only 1% of the town were able to vote or franchised. The workers thus turned to peaceful protest to raise their issues. Chartism was a national workers' movement born out of the destitution and harsh working conditions of the time, including mass content that had been increasing dramatically during the 1930s, encouraged by the economic depression of 1937 to 38. In Llanidloes district, the situation was made worse by the growing crisis in the flannel industry, with competition from northern mill towns and threat to the prospects of handloom weavers due to the introduction of water-powered looms. The Poor Law Act of 1834, which replaced poor law relief from the parish with grim institutional workhouses, was another significant cause of mass resentment, as were the Corn Laws, which kept grain prices artificially high, and the 1833 Factory Act. The movement took its name from the People's Charter of 1838, which demanded for votes for all men, and other changes to a political system which denied democratic rights to all but the privileged gentry. In Llanidloes, only 86 men, just over 2% of all constituents, were allowed to vote. In England, the main centres of militancy linked with the movement were the Midlands and the industrial north, whilst in Wales there was major activity and indeed disruption in Newport. The government and the ruling classes were hostile to any group advocating workers' rights and saw them as dangerous revolutionaries. 2 Chartist petitions, backed by huge numbers of supporters, were totally rejected by Parliament, giving impetus to those in the movement who were calling for the use of force to achieve a fairer system. Others, concentrated in Leicester, were seeking change by peaceful reform on the strength of moral force. By 1839, there was a hardening of attitudes as to the means of achieving the Chartist aims, and a belief that the use in physical force as opposed to moral force was increasingly being advocated. The motto, peacefully if we can, forcibly if we must, was increasingly used after the Chartist National Convention. Of the Birmingham Political Union, the Chartists, were set up in Llanidloes in 1838, led by Richard Jerman, master carpenter. Branches were also established in Newtown and Welshpool. Of course, Newtown was the birthplace of Robert Owen, and another local man, Thomas Jerman, was active in promoting both Owenite socialism and Chartism. He had connections to the national leaders of Fergus O'Connell and Bronter O'Brien. In October 1838, the first Chartist petition was approved, and Charles Jones of Welshpool was chosen as delegate to the Chartist National Convention, which convened on the 4th of February 1838, whilst ironmonger Thomas Powell of Welshpool was also prominent, being a friend of the national leaders Hugh Williams and Henry Hetherington, who visited the area. Meetings were held at a number of places in town, but included the Red Lion. The Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834 did result in violence and troops being required to restore order in Llanfair Caereinion, and in 1837 when the relieving officer was attacked. On Christmas Day 1838, a group of Chartists processed to the place. Workhouse, Caersws Workhouse was being erected. Thomas Powell, Charles Jones and others spoke about the Charter and the repeal of the Corn Laws and the new Poor Law. Older British readers may remember Sir Rhodes Boyson, MP, the Minister for Education in the Thatcher government. Well, his undergraduate thesis concerned the storming of Haslingden Workhouse in Lancashire. In March 1838, Charles Jones took leave of absence from the convention to tour his home area with Chartist orator Henry Hetherington. On the 9th of April 1839, three Chartists, Powell, Jones, Hetherington, arrived in Newtown and addressed a huge but peaceable crowd. Chartism in this climate provided the focus for a steady growing resentment amongst the people. In early 1839, there had been a large but peaceful public meeting in Llanidloes, addressed by Henry Hetherington, a leading London Chartist and campaigner for the free press. At that time, the wealthy landowners, magistrates, clerics and members of parliament had all the local power and influence, and they were determined to retain their exclusive rights of privilege and property. When later that month there were rumours locally of armed uprising, the magistrates became alarmed and demanded military and police support from the Home Secretary. The normal force in the town consisted of just one elderly night watchman and some unpaid part-time constables. Thomas Edmund Marsh was a powerful man in the town at the time. He was a wealthy landowner, lawyer, magistrate and former mayor. As the Llanidloes magistrates warned of serious unrest, 3 constables were sent from London, and the authorities were asked to recruit special constables locally. Marsh promptly recruited 300 men, mostly believed to be his own tenants, who would have been unable to refuse for fear of losing their jobs and homes. The arrival of these improvised and crudely armed forces on the streets of the town on April the 29th, 1839, only served to aggravate the situation and increase the tensions locally. The 3 police constables dispatched from London arrived at Llanidloes that evening. On a lovely spring morning of April the 30th, 1839, it was a Tuesday at an early hour. Information that the police had arrived from London leaked out through the domestic at the Trewythen Arms Hotel on Great Oak Street. It was also stated that they had come for the purpose of arresting the Chartist leaders, Abraham Owen, 48, a weaver, Lewis Humphreys, 29, a shoemaker, and Thomas Jerman, 27, a carpenter, to imprison them in the Trewythen Arms. The intelligence spread rapidly through the town and caused the greatest excitement amongst the Chartists. After conferring together, the leaders determined to call a meeting of their supporters. Lewis Baxter, armed with a long tin horn, was sent to parade the streets, and after each flourish of this musical instrument, he announced the fact that an assembly of the members of the Union would be held on Long Bridge Street. The tin horn, which is still preserved as a sacred relic in the family of the bugler, was styled by the Chartists as the Horn of Liberty, while the soldiers who visited the town after the outbreak dubbed it the Chartist Bugle. This prompted the crowd to head there from Longbridge. Indeed, some reports that women were particularly active encouraging the crowd. Finding the Trewythen surrounded by 50 of Marshal's special constables armed with wooden staves, the police fired their guns through the door, but it ultimately burst open. Shortly afterwards, the mob stormed the hotel and released their fellow Chartists from the kitchen. Now, many of the crowd were not Chartist, but disorientated townspeople, and if anything, it was more of an anti-police riot. They overpowered the guards, sacked the hotel, and freed the 3 Chartists who had indeed been arrested. 2 of the London constables hid in a hayloft, and a third, P.C. Blenkhorn, was badly beaten with iron rods before escaping. The current mayor, a surgeon by profession, was found in one of the bedrooms. Presumably he'd been there following a meeting of the magistrates, which was called to sign the arrest warrants of the 3 Chartists. Frightened when brought onto the street, the mayor appealed to their better nature by recalling their memories of how he saved their mothers' lives in ushering them to the world. Their hearts were softened, and they allowed him to proceed to his home without injuring him. Local landowner T. Marsh had drafted over 100 special constables from amongst his reluctant tenants, effectively pitting neighbour against neighbour. The interior of the hotel was wrecked, including some fine furnishings from the previous owner, a General Jones who'd fought in the American War of Independence. Although it's said that the only theft was of beer barrels from the cellars, the contents of which were largely poured away. Some sources suggest that it looked as though it was going to backfire on him. It was Marsh who himself threw the first stone and started the riot by breaking a window, presumably so that he could escape to Shrewsbury and raise the alarm. It would also seem that Marsh's property was also attacked. Again, it was claimed that the women in particular followed Marsh's example. The authorities seem to have greatly exaggerated the scale of disorder in Llanidloes, with reports of 500 armed Chartists, and called upon the Lord Lieutenant at Powys Castle for immediate assistance to control the situation. It was also rumoured that large reinforcements of Chartists would arrive from Merthyr Tydfil. Whilst the Times claimed that Llanidloes was in possession of revolutionaries. Inside the town, wanted posters were put up, offering rewards for the capture of the 3 escaped men and other known Chartist leaders. Thomas Powell was in Newtown and hurried to Llanidloes. He attempted to calm the crowd and helped P.C. Armishaw, an injured Welshpool policeman, to safety. The period was named the 5 Days of Freedom, and a mould was even cast to strike coins for an independent Llanidloes. On Tuesday the 30th of April to Saturday the 4th of May 1839, Llanidloes remained quiet and orderly due to Chartist patrols. With Mr. Marsh and his constables ejected from Llanidloes, inside the atmosphere was said to have been good-natured and festive. The Chartists had received intimation of the arrival of the force and immediately dispersed themselves. Some to their homes and others took to the hills around Rhaiadr on their way to Merthyr Tydfil. On Saturday, the troop reinforcements requested by the authorities arrived, including infantrymen from Brecon and a combined force of the Montgomeryshire Yeoman Cavalry, commanded by the Honourable C. Wynne MP, and the North Shropshire Yeomanry, under the command of Lord Clive. And yes, the very same yeomanry to which Mad Jack Mitten had belonged, totalling some 200 strong, riding into town with their sabres drawn. The military encountered no resistance at all, and doubtless soon judged that the response was excessive. Even the most ambitious Chartists knew that they'd never be able to hold Llanidloes for very long. So by the time the soldiers entered the town, the feeling seems to have been that the protest had already made its point, and there was nothing to be gained from a pitched battle that they couldn't win. The town was later sealed off, and 33 Chartists, including 3 women, were arrested and sent to Montgomery jail. Hugh Williams, the Carmarthen lawyer and radical, defended the Chartists. A military garrison was maintained in the town until the summer of 1840, whilst Welshpool and Newtown were also occupied, with Lord Clive basing his troops in Welshpool. In addition, pensioned but armed Shropshire yeomanry were sent to Montgomery to protect the jail. In spite of their presence, there was a second outbreak at Llanidloes on May the 7th. It was then that Thomas Powell was arrested. He received a sentence of 12 months, but in order to obtain his release, he had to find sureties, totaling £800, to ensure that he kept the peace for 5 years. He was not imprisoned for the riot of the 30th of April, but for using seditious words on the 9th of April, even though they were witnesses who denied that his speeches were inflammatory. On his release, Powell became shopman to Hetherington in London and figured in Hetherington's trial of 1841, for the sale of literature which was considered to be blasphemous. Powell was then active in colonial projects and organised a party to emigrate to South America, but this proved a failure. He settled in Trinidad and is said to have married a black woman, despite there being no proof that the attack had been planned by the Chartists. 2 of the readers, Abraham Owen and Lewis Humphreys, were amongst those captured and sent to New South Wales on the convict ship Woodbridge, as was James Morris, a 19-year-old weaver transported from Woolwich in October 1839, having been accused of stabbing a special constable. However, Thomas Jerman escaped via Liverpool to America, where he settled in Mankato, Minnesota, and had a family, fighting in the American Civil War of 1860 for the North. John Evans, a tailor, John Lewis... I've put tat, I don't know what that means. John Evans and John Lewis were each sent to prison for 12 months hard labour. Others were sent to prison for 6 months, with or without hard labour, and other lesser sentences, all at Montgomery. Whilst on the face of it little was achieved, the uprising could be seen as paving the way for the famous and ultimately more successful Chartist protests. 5 of the 6 demands of the People's Charter of 1838, the exception being annually elected parliaments, later became a part of the British Constitution. In keeping with my description of how everything has become commodified, Chartist 1770 is the name given to an upmarket restaurant at the Trewythen Hotel in Llanidloes.